Yeah, I'm going to talk about depth of field in photography, or DOF shortly. And I'm going to talk about the elements that affect the depth of field, how you can control it, and more importantly, why you need to know this information, how is it useful for your photography. So very shortly said, the depth of field is the size in depth of the place where all your elements are in sharp. So when you are focusing with your camera, you'll get a depth of field starting from, let's say, here, and ending either here in this area or going beyond to the infinity. You can only have one depth of field per photo, and if you're asking yourself why I'm saying this almost stupid thing, it's because I receive all sorts of questions. People are asking if I can have a depth of field or a clarity over here, then blur, then another place where there is clarity. No, you can only have one depth of field, one area where you have everything in focus. There are three elements that you can alter or change in order to affect the depth of field. The focal length, this means the millimeters of your lens, if it's a wide angle or telephoto, the aperture, and the place where you make the focus. There is also a fourth element that controls the depth of field, and that is the size of your sensor, but you can't do anything about it. Now let's talk about how these elements affect the size of the depth of field. When you're having a wide angle lens, wide means starting from 16 millimeters up to 24 millimeters on a full frame body. So when you are photographing with wide angle lens and you're closing down the aperture at f8, f11, f16, the depth of field will always start to a certain point in front of the lens and will end to infinity. And that is why, as landscape photographers, we use this type of settings, usually a wide angle lens, and you close down the aperture at f8, f11 or f16, because you want the depth of field to start to a place and end to infinity. Now the minute you start to increase the focal length, this means adding some zoom or increasing the number of millimeters, the depth of field decreases, becomes thinner and thinner. And normally, to keep a depth of field that starts to a certain point and ends to infinity, you will need to close down the aperture more and more and more. Not always you want a depth of field that starts to a place and ends to infinity, because when you're photographing portraits, for example, you want a depth of field placed on a certain specific point, and that is the subject. And that is the moment when you increase the focal length, you open the aperture, and then you have a depth of field that starts into a point, and that is shortly before the focus point and ends shortly after the focus point. And that is why you get blur in front of the subject and blur behind the subject. If you are a beginner photographer, in order for you to completely understand what is happening, you should only alter one element per time. And that means choose your focal length, focus the subject, and see what depth of field looks, see where there is blur and where there is not blur, and then only change the aperture. The minute you start closing the aperture, going to f8, f11, f16, you will see that the depth of field starting to grow, and this means you will not only have your subject in focus but also the background and some foreground elements. The minute you open your aperture, you will start seeing that the depth of field decreases in size, becomes thinner or shallower, and this means that only your subject will be in focus. All lenses have a minimum focus distance. This is the minimum distance to where they can focus, and usually this is almost equal to the minimum focal length. This means if you're photographing with 16 millimeters on a full frame body, you can roughly focus at about 20 centimeters from the lens. If you're using a 70 millimeter lens with a full frame body, then you get like 1 meter to be the minimum focus distance. Now for that minimum focus distance, even for wide angle lens, you need a really close aperture to create a depth of field that starts to a certain point and ends to infinity. Usually at that minimum distance, you will only get a depth of field that has a certain size. So in other terms, this translates to the closer the subject is to your lens, then the thinner the depth of field is, and you get much more blur. So if you want to get the biggest blur that you can, then go to the maximum focal length and focus as close as possible, and then you will have blur all the way. And if you also open the aperture, then you'll have a really shallow depth of field, or the minimum depth of field that lens with that particular focal length and that particular aperture can get. Now I hope you found all this information useful. You can support me by subscribing to this YouTube channel, and you can also buy one of my editing courses. The link is in the description of this video. If you have questions, you can use the comment section below. You can also add information to what I said. And until next time, keep on photographing, because it's the only way that you can get better. Bye bye.